Okay, so this is AG Merrick Garland visiting Uvalde, Texas. And I got booked late yesterday while I was still up in Dallas. Ooh, they're calling me.
Over 12 years ago, about 12 years ago, almost 12 years ago, after the Sandy Hook shooting, shattered families went to the United States Senate and they begged, they pleaded.
Allie, you were there that day. What did you see then? What are you learning now?
Yeah, then Kelly, it's hard to go back to that day about 20 months ago. What was the first one here on scene? They didn't even have caution tape up yet. I remember just walking right up to talk to Texas DPS troopers because there was no public information officer on scene. They were still bloodied from helping the children that were being removed from that building because the scene was still very active when I arrived. That's how early I was there, Kelly. And now we're dealing with this release of this review. A lot of emotions. You just heard from the families, of course, and a lot of them are learning about this review. I mean, this report is over 500 pages. They just got it about an hour ago as well. They haven't gone through all of it, but a lot of tears and a lot of frustration as well. As you said, a lot of them are calling for legal action, some calling for new gun laws as well, something that you would expect to see after a shooting like this. Now, one of the things that we really talked about, Attorney General Garland talked about in the news conference, was about how this was a cascading failure. He just kept repeating that the law enforcement response here, Kelly, was an absolute failure. They highlighted different things like the culture of complacency with unlocked doors, the lack of training. Most of these officers that arrived on scene did not have active shooter training. Most of them had never worked in a multi-agency setting either, so they weren't familiar with working together. Another issue was that they did not establish a command center very early on. They didn't even establish command. Pete Arredondo, the school district's chief, was actually the one who was in that command post, and he didn't even have his radios. He said he wanted to be hands-free, so he was using his cell phone and using verbal commands and dealing with multiple agencies. Agencies arrived on scene here, Kelly, and they didn't know what was going on. They had transitioned under Chief Arredondo from an active shooter situation into that barricaded subject. That is what Attorney General Garland said was probably the biggest failure. That changed all the posturing, people that arrived on scene. All of that got carried on throughout the day because these individuals didn't know. Some of them thought the shooter was in custody at that point. Some of them thought that the kids were safe. There were a lot of different conflicting reports out there that were never corrected from law enforcement, conflicting issues that were leading families to believe things that weren't accurate. There were issues with families being reunited with their children. There were some children, Kelly, we're learning that were actually shot, had bullet wounds, and they were put on school buses to be transported without actual adequate medical screening. There was one victim that was laid outside on the ground where she passed away. We're learning all of these gruesome, really, really hard details here today because of this report. And again, a lot of the information that was provided from law enforcement was inaccurate. And another really big thing here, Kelly, is the Associate Attorney General also made note of this, that basically the Uvalde School District police force was operating under a kind of template, if you will. They didn't actually had a set operating procedure. They didn't have an SOP. They were just basically going by the seat of their pants out here. And the template that they had offered resources that they didn't even have available to them at Robb Elementary. So that is what the chief on site that was calling the shots was under a blanket template for how to respond to these situations. So Merrick Garland saying that one of the things that they obviously need to do is training. Training would help a lot of these different situations that we've watched unfold, a lot of these scenarios that could have been different, he says, could all really be managed by that training, Kelly. Obviously, still a lot to go through here, a lot of little pieces standing out to me because I have been, of course, in the thick of it for almost 2 years now. But it's hard to sit here and go through this and to be here with the families again nearly 2 years later and still not really have a lot of closure, right? Robb Elementary is still standing. They have not taken that building down because there are still ongoing investigations, Kelly.
Yeah, the details that we're hearing so far, absolutely maddening. Allie Bradley, thank you.
Pages of it is really bringing much closure to any of these families. They want legal action. They want more to be done when it comes to what happens with the school systems, what happens with city policing, and what happens, how they all work together. And that's one of the things that Attorney General Merrick Garland really pointed out during the building and firing off those first rounds. 5 of them attempted to go to that door. Well, when the shooter started shooting at that door, they took on shrapnel and they all retreated. And it was then that Pete Arredondo and that other officers made that determination to transition it to a barricaded subject. They then started evacuating the classrooms. Take a listen to what AG Garland had to say about that move and how it was one of the most egregious infractions that happened that day.
Law enforcement officials prioritized a protracted evacuation of students and teachers in other classrooms instead of immediately rescuing the victims trapped with the active shooter. It meant that officials spent time trying to negotiate with the subject instead of entering the room and confronting him. It meant that officials asked for and waited for additional responders and equipment instead of following generally accepted active shooter practice and moving toward the shooter with the resources they had. It meant waiting for a set of keys to open the classroom door, which the report concludes was likely unlocked anyway.
Now, Kelly, they also talked about Uvalde having kind of a culture of complacency when it comes to those doors being unlocked, as you just heard AG Garland saying. That door that they fumbled with keys for around 40 minutes, it was likely unlocked anyways because the shooter likely didn't go in there after he unlocked the door and then locked it behind him. So that is something that they're saying is part of the problem there. Now, when we talk about the victims here, some of the other things that we're learning in this report is that some of these young kids, we know they were waiting 77 minutes. Some of them calling 911. One of them was even reportedly told, if you need help, say you need help. Apparently, that gunman was in the other room. That child said they needed help. The gunman re-entered the room that child was in and shot them and killed them. And these children were actually removed from this building once they finally gained access to it. Kelly, we're learning some of them were put on buses with bullet wounds without being adequately checked medically. We learned that a person was brought out to the sidewalk, a victim who was bleeding and died there on the sidewalk. There were so many things that are coming out from this report. Like I said, these families aren't getting any closure here. They want legal action, a lot of calls for new gun laws. We will be chatting with Mayor Don McLaughlin here pretty soon. He was the mayor when all of this happened. He's the reason this investigation even brought forward, Kelly. So we'll be talking with him here shortly and bring that to you.
Yeah, and so many of these details absolutely maddening, as you rightly point out. Allie Bradley, thank you. Well, retaliatory airstrikes raising tensions.
There's a CNN crew. Or this is CNN. Yeah, I recognize that guy. He's CNN. Pretty sure. Maybe not. Oh, I don't know. Everyone's looking the same to me. There's my setup. And here's my view.
News Nation's Allie Bradley live from Uvalde, Texas today. Allie was one of the first reporters on the scene in that terrible shooting back in 2022, and now we have this new report out today. I know you spoke with the town's former mayor. So bring us up to speed and tell us what the reaction has been.
Yeah, hey, Connell, out here in Uvalde, of course, you can see 21 crosses still standing beside me. Also, Robb Elementary still standing despite a lot of conversations about that school being raised, but the investigations are still ongoing. But this is that DOJ report, over 500 pages. And you talk about this community here and what they're dealing with. And almost 2 years ago now, 20 months ago, this happened. And I'll tell you what, Connell, a lot of people didn't get a lot of closure from this. The mayor telling me this doesn't offer a lot of closure. It brings up a lot of really hard feelings and hard emotions, as you might imagine, but it might just be a step forward. Mayor Don McLaughlin was actually the one who first called the Associate Attorney General requesting this review in the first place. So the DOJ spent 54 days out here in Uvalde. They collected around 14,000 pieces of data, body camera footage, photos, other things that they could sift through. And what we found in this report that really stuck out to me, because of course, being one of the first ones down here, I saw everything unfold, and then we saw the aftermath and a lot of the different discrepancies that were coming out. So this really lays all of that out. And one of the things that really stood out to me was that they did not set up that command center. They did not have an actual person in control of this situation down here. We know the de facto commander became Pete Arredondo. He's the chief of the Uvalde School District. He's a former chief, I should say. And I learned here, Connell, that they never even had a standard operating procedure. They didn't even have policies and procedures listed out for them to go off of. They were basically operating under a template with resources that weren't even available to them. Pete Arredondo didn't have radios on him, didn't have communications to be able to talk to other agencies. Other agencies responded, and what Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, said was the biggest issue that he saw was that Pete Arredondo and other officers made that transition from an active shooter situation to a barricaded subject situation. And what happened there was that changed the posture for everybody. They turned into an evacuation squad, basically getting people out of the school instead of charging in and subduing that shooter and getting those children out of there. Now, when it comes to the survivors and the victims here, this report is also something that is supposed to honor those individuals as well. Now, of course, one of the other big issues that we learned here, Connell, was complacency with a culture of unlocked doors. Now, what I learned here in this report is that all exterior doors were unlocked in that building that the shooter actually entered in. 8 of the interior doors were all unlocked as well. Those were all supposed to be locked, Connell, to keep those kids safe inside that school.
Yeah, I mentioned, Allie, that you were one of the first reporters that was down there when it happened. You've gone through some of this. A lot of this we already knew, as bad as it was. We knew it was, the response was not. But what did we learn today that really stood out individually to you that was new? You mentioned the command center, I suppose, was one thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that was a big part of it. I think one of the other things, again, was that they didn't have that training laid out, or those policies and procedures. Another really interesting thing is most of these officers that responded didn't have active shooter training, and they didn't have training working within other agencies. So they weren't able to really be a cohesive unit, especially without a command center, without a command post. It eventually was set up down at the funeral home eventually, but again, that was some time. And now we also learned that kids that were wounded in those classrooms, Connell, were actually put on buses with bullet wounds before even being adequately medically checked, and they were taken to that reunification center. We were also told families were getting misinformation left and right, and none of that was corrected. So they were being left to figure out where their children were, if they were even alive out there. So we're learning all of these different things. And one of the other really sobering moments in this packet here that we were reading is one of the young victims was directed by someone in that classroom to, if you need help, say you need help. That victim, that child, said they needed help, and that gunman came back in from that other room, Connell, and he came in and he shot that little kid who said they needed help. And those are some of the things that we learned in this report, and exactly why a lot of these families aren't necessarily going to be getting closure from this more than 500-page report. Instead, they're calling for change and action. There were nearly 300 of them. Some of them have been implemented. We know that some personnel changes have been made, like Pete Arredondo. He was the acting chief of the Uvalde Consolidated Independent School District. He has since been fired. The acting chief, Marcus, also has been removed.
Correspondent Allie Bradley is live in Uvalde, Texas. And Allie, you were actually there on that fateful day. This report is nearly 2 years in the making. What are parents saying after reading it?
Yeah, being back here in Uvalde, Elizabeth, you can just still feel the pain, the agony that this community is still reeling with. 20 months later, it's palpable being back here. You can see the little crosses still here, 21 people, those lives were lost. Robb Elementary still standing despite talks of having it razed and removed from the area. But the parents here, the families here, still reeling with this pain. And you would think that maybe there would be some kind of closure with this massive report. But that's not at all what they're getting here, Elizabeth. Instead, there are more renewed calls for change and for some action to be taken.
For these officers to sit there and just not do anything, and still be out here, on the streets like nothing happened, And my daughter's gone. It was hard. It was hard.
Daughters and sons, 19 children and 2 teachers killed at Robb Elementary School. Parents speaking out today after the Justice Department released a nearly 600-page report detailing a long list of law enforcement failures on that day. On page 7, the list of the lives lost, most of them only 9 or 10 years old.
Our children deserve better than to grow up in a country where an 18-year-old has easy access to a weapon that belongs on the battlefield, not in a classroom.
The former mayor of Uvalde requested the DOJ investigation. He tells News Nation he hopes this can help parents heal.
There's some more pieces of the puzzle that have been put together now. I don't think it brings them closure, but I think it gives them more information than they've had.
Attorney General Merrick Garland was shown the murals painted in memory of the victims. Their parents saying this report shows that they can't stop pushing for change.
We're going to continue fighting. We're going to continue fighting that some type of change is made in honor of our kids. We have nothing left but to fight for them.
And Elizabeth, you talked about those parents that were told that their children were safe and they were not. And I just opened up this report to this page, and I just wanted to read what this Facebook post shows from Uvalde School District Police, saying that all campuses are under a lockdown status. Please know at this time, all campuses are under a lockdown status. The students and staff are safe in the buildings. That is a notification that those parents received on that day while gunshots were still ringing out, Elizabeth. Now we can tell you some of the report's recommendations. They've already been implemented. We know that Pete Arredondo, he was a school district chief. He has been fired. So has Chief Marinano Pargas. He was with Uvalde PD. They've both been removed. Now also Mayor Don McLaughlin, he was in place during this shooting. He has now since removed himself from that position, but he tells me, Elizabeth, that he doesn't believe that any of those responding officers actually did anything criminal. He does acknowledge and believes that they made mistakes, and that, of course, with bad decision-making came, of course, those bad mistakes, Elizabeth.
Yeah, many family members, however, Allie, as you know from being on the scene there, take issue with that. We're going to talk to one in a moment who feels criminal charges are warranted in this case. Thank you so much, Allie Bradley, for that live report from Uvalde. Let's break down a little bit more with...
All right, healthy dinner and breakfast from the grocery store. I am so burnt out on restaurants. Never thought I'd say I'd get tired of restaurant steaks, but I'm like sodium overdosed